Greetings from Mrs. McConnell. For most of you, I'm an unfamiliar face, but I taught at Juan Diego for many years, and I still teach AP Art History online with one of my most talented former students, Mrs. Whitaker. When she asked me to sub for her world history classes, I said sure, but I really wanted to teach an actual lesson. How about the Partition of Africa? Mrs. Whitaker replied. As it happens, I know a lot about that episode in history. I lived in Africa, Uganda, as an exchange student my junior year of high school, and I studied the Partition of Africa in graduate school with a couple of scholars who really upended the debate about what happened and why. More on that in a minute. But then I rather floored Mrs. Whitaker by asking, can I teach it using works of art? She was nice enough, or relieved enough, to say yes. So here we go. Today I want to look at 4 works of art, 3 African, 1 European, that I think may give you a little different perspective on this rather weird episode in the history of the world that we call the Scramble for Africa. But first, I'm going to indulge in a little political theory. You haven't gotten to the Russian Revolution yet, but I'm guessing most of you have heard of Comrade Lenin. 4 years after he seized power in Russia, he gave a speech to one of the many Communist Party congresses where he summed up history in 2 words, kto, kovo. This translation that I screenshot from Wikipedia is a little too polite. Я изучила русский язык в университете, но я забыла почти всё. Translation, I studied Russian for 3 years in college, but have forgotten almost all of it. What I do remember, however, is that kto, kovo basically translates as who, whom. Who, kto, as the subject form, whom, kovo, as the object form. So a cruder but really more accurate translation would probably be who's doing it to whom. In Lenin's framework, history was a story of victors and vanquished, subjects and objects, actors and those acted upon. So what do you think? You just read about the Scramble for Africa. Is this a pretty good description of what happened? The European ktos did it to the African kavos? Your reading and this map suggests that Lenin had a point. In just over 30 years, a handful of European countries dominated by Britain and France took formal control of most of Africa. So here's a French cartoon from the 1890s. What do you think it's saying? Well, basically, we see German Chancellor Bismarck cutting an Africa cake into pieces and handing them out at the Berlin Conference of 1884. The cake does not seem to have any say in what happens to it. How about this 1892 cartoon from the British magazine Punch? Any guess about who this guy is and what point the cartoon is making? That's Cecil Rhodes bestriding Africa like a Colossus, which is a play on Shakespeare's description of Julius Caesar. Looks like a kto to me. But since I'm not a huge Lenin fan, and since I'm a longtime student of African history and politics, I have some problems with the simplistic interpretation of the Scramble for Africa as European ktos simply imposing their imperial will on African kavos. Part of my problem is that it doesn't really answer a major question. Why did the Europeans bother? Why, in what was really a short period of time, did they suddenly decide to carve up an entire continent? What was in it for the European imperialists? What was in it for the ktos? If we dig down below the simplistic, because it was there for the taking answer, we discover that there were several reasons why Europeans suddenly took a much greater interest in Africa at the end of the 19th century. It turns out there wasn't just one kto, or group of people taking charge. There were a lot of ktos, and they had rather different motives. This is a recent map, so it leaves out a few important raw materials, especially palm oil from West Africa, which was an ingredient in soap. One of the interesting developments of the Industrial Revolution is that cotton cloth was being produced in abundance, and it could actually be washed. Suddenly, people smelled much, much better, but they also needed to buy much, much more soap. Anyway, you get the picture. The Industrial Revolution meant that new industries needed a lot of raw materials. Africa had a lot of raw materials. Cecil Rhodes, for example, built his fortune on diamond mines in South Africa. The new industries were also looking for markets to sell their products. Didn't all those Africans need cotton cloth and soap too? So this is the most standard explanation for the Scramble for Africa. It was driven by economic imperialism. That was certainly Lenin's theory. He actually wrote a whole book about it. But greed didn't motivate everyone. The 19th century not only witnessed an industrial revolution, it also witnessed a major religious revival in Europe and America. Catholic and Protestant missionaries rushed to Africa to establish churches, schools, hospitals, and seminaries. Sure, they wanted to win converts for their team, but that's too simplistic and too ungenerous an explanation. Many of these missionaries genuinely wanted to improve their, I'd say really most, genuinely wanted to improve the lives as well as the eternal prospects of Africans. Also, many of these missionaries protested the ill treatment of Africans by their own, that is, their own colonial governments, especially by colonial administrators. European missionaries often pushed governments to establish more direct, more efficient, and more fair government control, partly to improve education and health care available to Africans. This became a popular cause in much of Europe. A great deal of pressure to establish official colonies as opposed to just trading posts came from church leaders and church congregations. Let me just note that most of the African leaders who founded independent states in the middle of the 20th century got their first chance at an education from a church school. Your reading states the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference to, quote, bring order to the scramble of Africa, unquote. That's true enough, but it doesn't really explain why Bismarck made the effort to convene an international conference about Africa in Berlin. Just think of all the catering involved. In fact, Bismarck did not give a hoot about Africa, and he thought the drive to establish colonies was both politically and economically stupid. What scared Bismarck was that after unifying Germany in a series of 3 wars, he was left with potentially hostile neighbors to the east, west, and south. In other words, Germany was powerful, but it was also surrounded. So Bismarck was actually quite happy to have England and France competing for colonies in Africa instead of thinking about Germany. It kept their minds off the growing power of Germany, right? He was also happy to have German imperialists dreaming about colonies in Africa instead of dreaming up ways to kick Bismarck out of power and regain control over German politics. But Bismarck did not want Britain and France to actually go to war over Africa. Again, not really because he cared about Africa, but because he was afraid it would turn into a European war that would spread to Germany. And when you study World War I, you'll see that he had something for point. But my biggest problem with the simplistic Kitoko conqueror-victim explanation of the scramble for Africa is that it seriously underestimates the determined resistance of many Africans to conquest. This was the point that my professor at Oxford made in a book about the Partition of Africa that really shook up scholarship on the subject in the 1960s and 1970s. But this interpretation doesn't always make it into high school world history textbooks. I think more frequently it has, more recently. Anyway, the images you're seeing here capture 3 big, if temporary, defeats for British imperialists. The Zulu Wars in South Africa, the Mahdi Rebellion in Sudan, and, on the top right, the War of the Golden Stool in what today is Ghana. Stay tuned, since that one's a war caused by a work of art. I'm going to tell you more about it in a few minutes. Actually, African armies often won battles, if not wars, against European armies, even though they had less sophisticated weapons and less formal military training. When this happened, humiliated European governments faced a lot of pressure from their public to get even. Remember, these European governments were becoming more democratic, sort of, and public opinion now mattered a whole lot more. Journalism was also more effective. Photos would reach Europe and people would see pictures of defeat and get angry. So Britain and France ended up sending more and more troops to quell uprising. And once they had subdued uprising, they found they had to follow through by setting up more formal government controls. I just note the U.S. has confronted a similar pattern in the last 70 years. Think of Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. Okay, Mrs. McConnell, you said you were going to talk about art. I'll cut to the chase. In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to look at 4 works of art and lead a discussion about insights that each of these works give us to the so-called Scramble for Africa. We'll start here. This is a work from the 1700s. In other words, this work dates to a period when contacts between Africa and Europe were on the rise, but European governments had not started establishing colonies in Africa, and indeed when the relations were much more equal. So what do you see here? Any guess about what's going on? I've circled two sections of the bronze sculpture, actually a shrine sculpture placed on an altar. I've also added another work from about the same period produced by those extraordinarily skilled artists of Benin. What do you think is the most important figure on this work, or who do you think? Well, it's the Oba, or King of Benin, in the center, the fellow I've circled in green. He's in the front, he's bigger than the others, he's staring right at us, and he's brandishing a weapon. The much smaller men that I've circled in red are, in fact, Portuguese musketeers. The fellow on the right is also a Portuguese soldier, modeled, again, by Benin craftsmen. These Portuguese soldiers were serving essentially in the military of the Oba. Benin was not a colony of Portugal. Benin was a major trading partner of Portugal. And again, the trade was on pretty equal terms. In fact, much of Benin's wealth stemmed from its highly profitable trade with Portugal. The brass used to make these splendid cast brass works came from manillas, or armbands worn by the Portuguese. They were melted down as raw materials for these altar shrines and for plaques commemorating Benin kings. I'm showing one of these on the right. What did the Portuguese get in return? They purchased pepper, cloth, ivory, and above all, slaves. One reason why the rulers of Benin fought so many battles with their neighbors was that the Obas were deeply involved in the profitable slave trade. The king himself had a monopoly over all trade, including people captured in wars with other tribes. That way, all of the profit went to support his court and his government. The Europeans themselves were seldom allowed to travel inland or even to visit Benin City to avoid having them trade without the authority of the king. On the left, you see a 1668 engraving, that is a European work that depicts the Oba's palace complex in Benin City. The Oba is shown in the foreground on horseback, surrounded by dancers, dwarves, and animals. His palace is in the background. The Portuguese understood elaborate royal courts. They had one back home, and that's what they found in Benin. Again, this was fundamentally a relationship between Cateaus, who interacted on a pretty equal basis. The Cavos, of course, were the unlucky captives who became slaves. Now we'll fast forward a couple of hundred years. The slave trade has been abolished, mostly thanks to pressure from abolitionist Christians in Britain and the British Navy's attacks on slave traders' forts in Africa. Now Britain replaces Portugal as the major trading partner of African kingdoms in what today is the country of Nigeria in West Africa. The British were interested in acquiring West African gold. Ghana was called the Gold Coast, and also, as I mentioned earlier, the palm oil used in making soap. Near the end of the 19th century, the military forces of a later Oba of Benin massacred a British trade delegation. Apparently this was without the Oba's knowledge or permission, but it raised a big stink in Britain. In particular, it was heavily covered by the popular press and created pressure on the British government to retaliate. But British industrialists, let's face it, were also happy to pick a fight because they wanted to strong-arm the Kingdom of Benin to allowing British traders more commercial access to the region. So, basically, Britain used this incident as an excuse to send in soldiers, what is called the Punitive Expedition of 1897. Most historians consider this British invasion to have been brutal and unjustified. But there's no question that the soldiers collected a lot of loot and hauled it away without the permission of the Oba or his people. One of their most outrageous acts was to tear the brass plaques representing Oba kings through 3 centuries off the walls of the Oba's palace. This is an act that single-handedly destroyed a 300-year chronology of a mighty African empire, a crime against history. Here are 2 screenshots from the diary of the British officer in charge of the Punitive Expedition. Note the very unsubtle caption he's written under the photo on the upper left, "More loot." And the story doesn't end there. Benin bronzes were sold off to museums in Europe and America. Britain, Germany, and the U.S. have the largest collections. And now Nigeria is trying to get them back. European and American museums are sometimes reluctantly and almost always incompletely complying. You're going to be reading about this in your next class. But just to continue with my theme that the story is complicated, when European art experts and then museum goers saw these works, they were blown away by the sophisticated craftsmanship, the technological mastery, and the elegant design of the Benin bronzes. While the theft of these great works is very hard to justify, it did have the unintended effect of challenging stereotypes about Africans. These were works that rivaled the masterpieces of Renaissance art, and European art experts actually said so publicly. I'm going to return to this in a moment. But meanwhile, on to my next work of art. The Ashanti golden stool is thought to contain the soul of the Ashanti nation. It isn't actually used as a stool. In fact, it's never allowed to touch the ground, and it has its own stool to sit on. Only the king, shown here, can touch the stool. When a British representative tried to sit on this stool, it started a war. Gotta love a war that starts over art. Let's watch 5 minutes of a somewhat cheesy video that gives background on this work and on the war. So the video leaves off with a really clueless British colonial officer making an outrageous demand. He wants to sit on the stool. The male Ashanti leaders were inclined to cave. The king had already been exiled. He'd seen the kind of force that Britain could bring to bear. But then in steps one of my favorite women in history. Asantewaa was the queen mother, and she led her people in what historians call the War of the Golden Stool. Here's an excerpt from the speech she delivered to a group of male Ashanti leaders. We have an eyewitness account of this speech, and historians think this is a pretty accurate rendition of what she said. I don't know if any of the men took up her offer and traded their loincloths for her underwear, but you gotta love a woman who didn't shut up and surrender. Let's continue briefly with the video. In the short term, the Ashanti imposed some serious losses on the British. Eventually, the superior British technology won the day, but in this case, the Ashanti queen and her people really won the war, since the British retreated from their demand for the golden stool, and it remains in the possession of the Ashanti people to this day. Okay, we need to move faster. This is one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, a portrait of a group of prostitutes in Barcelona, Spain. Avignon, although it's a city in France, was in Barcelona, the street where they hung out. There are a lot of reasons why this work is famous, but one of these reasons is that the two prostitutes on the right have African masks as faces. So what's your reaction? Is this insulting, horrifying, interesting? What does it say about European attitudes toward Africa toward the end of the Scramble for Africa? If some of you find the depictions insulting, I'm not surprised. But in fact, Picasso and other European painters of the early 20th century were deep admirers of African art, and especially of the artistry of African masks. André Derain was a French painter who collected fang masks from what today is Cameroon, shown here. Picasso was a close friend of Derain's and frequently came over to see his collection. So here's a painting by Derain that reflects the influence of his African art collection. The style was referred to as primitivism, which many people now find insulting. What do you think? And what point am I getting at here? Greater contact between African and European cultures did not just impose European values on Africans, it introduced Europeans and Americans to the cultural richness of African art and culture. Sometimes the response was condescending. I think primitivism is a pretty condescending label, but recognized that there was a lot of admiration, indeed fascination, with what was perceived as the vibrancy of African culture. Okay, last work. I'm almost done. This is an example of what is called installation art. It's not a painting. It's an assemblage of sculpted figures sitting around in chairs or around a table in chairs. What's going on here? What event do you think this is portraying? It's the Congress of Berlin, right? The one that carved up the cake. So what point do you think the artist is trying to make? Why don't the figures have heads? What kind of clothes are they wearing? I'll share what a museum website says. The scramble for Africa by leading European and world powers resulted in the carving up of the continent, an act that was formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85. Shonibare's work depicts this historic gathering, showing various statesmen huddled around a table with a large map of Africa, eagerly staking their claims. In Shonabare's interpretation, the heads of state are characteristically headless and equally mindless in their hunger for what Belgian King Leopold II called a slice of this magnificent cake. Remember the cake cartoon I showed you earlier? It's pretty clear that this British Nigerian artist knows the reference. And now you know the source of the cake imagery. But what about the clothes? So here's another commentary from a university website. Arranged in theatrical poses, each mannequin is dressed in a Dutch wax print fabric. This cloth further hints at the process of colonization, as the Dutch wax prints were originally based on batik fabrics that originated in Indonesia, a former Dutch colony. The Dutch and English, who manufactured the fabric, later found a stronger market in West Africa, and over time, the prints have become most closely associated with an African identity and are in fact manufactured in Africa. Indeed, Kente cloth, inspired by a colonial exchange between Indonesian weavers, Dutch colonialists, and Ashanti artists, is now one of Africa's leading art forms and leading exports. So what's the moral of the story, if there is one? History is complicated. The Partition of Africa is one of the uglier episodes in European history, a story of conquest and exploitation. But it's also a story of resistance and resilience. And I'll end on a hopeful note. The understanding that history doesn't just tell the story of Cateau's oppressing Cavos. It also tells the story of cultures learning and growing from contact with each other. I recently visited London as I wandered around doing my tourist thing, and yes, that included a lot of art museums. I passed by several times the entrance to Britain's Royal Academy of Art. This is ground central of the establishment art community in Great Britain. The Royal Academy's big 2021 summer exhibition was organized by one of the leading artists of the Royal Academy, Yinka Shonibare, the artist who created the work we just saw. Shonibare was born in England of Nigerian parents, grew up in Nigeria, and now works in both countries. He is, if you will, something of a citizen of the world. He's the artist who created the work we just saw. I've said that before. At any rate, I'm going to end here, finally. On Canvas, I've posted a guided reading quiz that explores one of the big problems that hangs over from the Scramble of Africa. What should happen to all that art that colonial armies looted and hauled off to Europe? Like the history I've just shared, it's a more complicated issue than it may seem at first. On the one hand, art surely belongs to the people who created it. On the other hand, aren't a lot more people going to see the extraordinary cultures of Africa in New York, London, or Berlin than in Edo, Nigeria? I don't think there's a clear right answer. It's something you'll want to think about for